Hello, everyone, and welcome to Matters of Mind. My name is Thomas, and this is the third volume I'm going through of Mircea Eliade's A History of Religious Ideas. This is a third in this series, and I'm happy to say I'm finally done with all three. It was a bit of a chore. They weren't always very entertaining, but I do feel like I got a glimpse into the matrix of the human mind. I understand a lot about humanity from reading these books. So I'm going to get into some of the ideas that I found interesting in these books. And of course, I don't go through every single idea. It's way too dense. Each catalog, each book in itself is way too dense to do that. So you can read the book if you want to get into more of the details, but even if you don't read every single part of the book, having these as a reference to any religious idea on your bookshelf, yeah, I think is a great idea. So let's get into it. All right, let's start out with the myth of the innocence. In modern times, we have witnessed a strange desire by some to follow the lead of children. Greta Thunberg is the most stark example of this. Why is it that a child who knows little, if anything, about the complex sciences and world development literature necessary to understand climate change and its impact leading the charge? And why are so many people paying attention to her? Well, in a civilization heavily influenced by the Christian religion, it makes sense. So, with Christianity, because of this shift towards the weak, the poor, and the innocent, Christianity has in it a mythology around children leading the way. Let me give you a quote from the book. It is simultaneously the myth of the innocent, the exaltation of the child by Jesus, and the popular reaction against the Baron's crusade, the same reaction which expressed itself in the legends that crystallized the Taurus of the First Crusades. Here's an example. In 1212, there was a child named Nicholas. He gathered a multitude of children and women and affirmed that he was commanded by an angel to liberate the Lord's cross in Jerusalem. So they walked from the region of Cologne, down the Rhine, crossed the Alps, and reached northern Italy. But the Pope didn't support them and pointed out that they were there without authoritative support, so they returned by foot. Many were said to have starved and died in the villages along their trail back home, and it was written that their bodies often littered the streets and nobody took time to bury them. Total catastrophe. Now, usually children are dismissed when expressing their opinions of complex and important ideas based on their lack of education or their authority on the matter. And that is what Pope did to Nicholas and his followers. Now, that's not to say that children by default are wrong or that we shouldn't listen to them, but there is a hierarchy of knowledge and experience with which we should consult and respect as we listen and then guide those children towards truth. Now, Nicholas wasn't the only child to have done this during the Christian Crusades. I'll put a link down below to a nice article about both of those mini crusades, many in size and many in children. But really, the Children's Crusades, what they did is they displayed the authoritative stance of the Catholic Church in how they were both seen as troublesome. The church didn't like the idea of people gathering on their own without guidance, as it can lead to a loss of their power. Why have the church when people can on their own follow the word of God and change history? Although later the Reformation was led not by children, the spirit of individual responsibility challenged again the established hierarchy in a similar fashion. Now, faith and reason. So I've heard several times the description of Americanism to be a melting together of faith and reason. So it can be hard for modern people to see this as even possible because there's this myth that faith somehow is the opposite of reason or that faith is in conflict with science, and it is not. In fact, Eliade outlines the rationale behind the development of science as what he calls magia naturalis, which represents a new attempt to work out a rapprochement between nature and religion. In fact, the study of nature constituted a quest for a better understanding of God. I don't know that any framework of thought is possible without first an act of faith. There seems to be some presumption of something unknowable at the bottom of every idea. It could be faith in the idea that truth is redemptive, or that the laws governing the universe are consistent across all corners of the universe. It could be faith in the idea that humanity should be free from suffering, or that it deserves to be. So, at the bottom of any of our pursuits, there lies an idea that is an assumption. That's what we would call a leap of faith. What it is that motivates us to action at its source. It's not rationally based, reasoned arguments. For example, a scientific paper that discusses the efficacy of cancer treatments never starts out by explaining why we should fight cancer in humans. It presumes that fighting cancer in humans is good, which presumes that reducing suffering for humans is good, which presumes that humans have something good to do and contribute to the world. Why otherwise would we be excited to save a life? And how do we even know that human life is worth saving? How can we prove that? In fact, not everyone believes that, as evidenced by the depopulation movements since the 70s and the degrowth environmentalism that we see today. We all know people have less children sometimes because they believe it is immoral to create too many humans. They say there are already too many people in the world. Why should I create more? That's a common trope. So what faith and reason do is actually contribute to each other. They exist in a dialogue. And we've used reason to understand our faith by subjecting it to reasoned arguments, by seeking to grasp and articulate what it is we have faith in. We identify what is both at the top, that towards which we should aim, and what is at the bottom, that which is fundamental. I found it interesting to follow some of these threads of development. Most of those were deeply studied and discussed by St. Thomas Aquinas, no relation. What he did is put faith to the test of reason. And important to understand is that this process started well more than 1,000 years ago. We've had more than 1,000 years of dialogue amongst some of the most intelligent and accomplished people in the world dealing with the intersection of faith and reason. So, a little bit about that. There's even a specific term in religious studies for this process called scholasticism. So, a quote from the book. In general, scholasticism designates the diverse theological systems aiming at the accord between revelation and reason, faith, and intellectual comprehension. Knowing that and then reading some of the fundamental arguments was a good reminder that none of the clever quips against either faith or reason are clever, much less new. I hear the roots of this reason versus faith argument in the desire for many to supplant the biblical influences of our civilization, especially the founding documents of the United States, with the rationality and reason so popularized and developed by Greek thought. But what Eliade points out here in the development of the Bible thought and Judaism is its power to sustain itself in the face of challenges from Greek thought. So Eliade describes the dance between Judaism and Greek thought as a dialogue in which both sides are reciprocally enriched. And here's a quote from the book. In effect, the Jewish religious genius is characterized at once by its fidelity to the biblical tradition and by its capacity to submit to numerous exterior influences without allowing itself to be dominated by them. So what I see as the most important of these influences and discussions between Greek thought and Judaism is the personal relationship with God that Judaism insists on. This is the root of equality in the Western world. If all individual human beings are in a personal relationship with God, then who are we to interrupt that? You don't see that in Greek thought as fundamentally as you do with Judaism, and sometimes it's the exact opposite. So Greek thought, from Aristotle to Plato and his dialogues of Socrates, often support directly inequality, presuming that some humans are better and thus more capable and should take responsibility to construct and lead human societies. That is the specific prescription that Plato provides in his Republic. In fact, Socrates goes as far to propose the censorship of poetry and art the type of items that would make most, if not all, religious documents illegal. He, in fact, wants to heavily censor their own Homeric poems like the Iliad and Odyssey. There would be no individual right nor responsibility to decide for oneself what to read and think. This is the direct opposite of fundamental beliefs necessary for Western civilization, which is heavily influenced by individualism. Without that sense of equality provided in Judaism and then Christianity, we would have no foundation from which to construct our Constitution. The Declaration of Independence and Constitution make no sense without an assumption of equality that is completely absent in Aristotle and Plato's framework of thought. Where reason provides the how, faith provides the why. The Declaration of Independence is a statement of why, individual equality, while the Constitution provides the structure for how individual equality is protected. Now, in the Reformation, this concept of individualism was heavily spread through the Reformation of Martin Luther. This is why Protestantism is so heavily linked with the founding and structure of what would become the United States. His breakdown of hierarchies in relation to how we come to have and nourish faith in God was the foundation for how we today understand individual equality. Here's another quote from the book. In the manifesto to the Christian nobility of the German nation in August of 1520, he rejected the supremacy of the people over the councils, the distinction between clergy and laity, and the clergy's monopoly in the study of Scripture. To this end, he recalled that all Christians, thanks to their baptism, are priests. Timing for Martin Luther's Reformation was also critical, in that the invention of a new version of the printing press allowed books, especially the Bible, to be printed and spread en masse throughout Western civilization. Literacy became a responsibility of each person in order to propagate and nourish their personal relationship with the divine. Eventually, most everyone had the mental capacity and resources to study and wrestle with faith on their own. Now, the importance of this idea is evidenced in other sources, namely the work of Joseph Henrich, who has done in explaining the development of weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies. The spread of literacy parallels the spread of Protestantism and Catholicism to a lesser extent, which affects the manner in which we think and the actual structures of our brain. People in literate societies have structural brain differences like a thickening of the corpus callosum. And if you know anything about the next book I'm reviewing, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind by Julian Jaynes, you know how important the corpus callosum is and how inhibition actually helps us to develop the differentiation between our old and new conscious selves. So in conclusion, reading and completing this third volume was a bit easier in that it's much shorter than the first two, but like the first two, there were times where I really had to push myself to complete the chapters. The discussions on religions that I wasn't at all familiar with were harder to get through, likely because I had no sense of how they related to the world in which I live today. But at best, there were hints of a similar view of how the world came to be, in that a near human universal is the symbolism of creating order out of chaos. Also, the microcosm, macrocosm concept. Almost all of the religious origin stories from all over the world throughout time involve a view that there was chaos, which we or the gods ordered as a means to control our world. The symbolism usually involves water as the chaos, as the fluid, and ends up with land or mud as the start of the new world, which is what order is, the land versus the water. The microcosm, macrocosm themes all involve seeing the universe as a macrocosm structure that is directly reflected in the microcosm of the human form, as well as nature itself. This is what first inspired humans to study nature in order to understand themselves and the universe. All knowledge would fit into that framework, so understanding nature would bring them closer to an understanding of God. So even though reading books like this isn't as entertaining as scrolling Instagram reels or binging Netflix, like the Wu-Tang series I'm on now, entertainment is not necessarily the goal of reading for me, but it can be, and I am sometimes entertained by it. But in order to understand our world today, it's important to understand the substance upon which it is founded. And I think without an understanding of religion and its development, which is a human universal, you cannot understand humanity nor yourself. So thanks again for joining me on this journey through these 3 books or any of other Jordan Peterson's books on his book list. I've got another one coming up real soon. I just finished Julian Jaynes' Origin of Consciousness. It blew my mind and really made me think about a lot of things in a very different way. So I'm eager to get that done. And that's it for today, and we'll see you in the comments. Have a good one.